On July 28, 2024, one of the leading luminaries of Jewish studies scholarship, David Biale, died at the age of 75. He was a 3-time winner of the National Jewish Book Award and a committed scholar activist who devoted his life not only to intellectual pursuits, but also to justice. His work had a profound influence on the ways we understand Judaism at Judaism Unbound, and in the wake of his passing, we wanted to re-release his episode of our podcast that was initially released toward the end of 2023. May David Biale's memory be a blessing, and may his work continue to contribute to the betterment of Judaism and humankind.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 411, Jewish Counter-History. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're continuing a sort of mini-unit that includes conversations about Jewish books that we think are awesome and important, and conversations with Jewish thinkers, in particular historians of Judaism, that we think are really important to our own thinking here on Judaism Unbound. A couple of weeks ago, we talked to Hasia Diner about American Jewish history. Last week, we dove into a novel from Adam Mansbach. And this week, we'll be talking about Jewish history again with David Biale. David Biale has written many books about Jewish history. And in celebration of his full career, a book has just come out called Jewish Culture Between Canon and Heresy, which is an amazing title if you ask us. It's a fascinating look into David Biale's groundbreaking work over many decades in shorter pieces, which you can dig into and then go off and read all of his full-length books, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes, all of which has made him an important leader in the field of Jewish studies. Just like our conversation with Hasia Diner a couple of weeks ago, today's conversation comes from basically a sense that, oh my gosh, why haven't we had this person on Judaism Unbound long ago? And as I think you'll see in the conversation, we should have. Hasia Diner and David Biale are some of really the intellectual giants that our own thinking stands on their shoulders. So just a few words of introduction. David Biale serves as the Emanuel Ringelblum Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Jewish History at the University of California, Davis. He is the author or co-author of 7 books, including Hasidism, A New History, and Gershom Scholem, Master of the Kabbalah. David Biale's most recent book is a collection of his essays, which I mentioned earlier, entitled Jewish Culture Between Canon and Heresy. He is also the editor of 4 other books, including Cultures of the Jews, A New History. David Biale's books have won the National Jewish Book Award 3 times, which is really a lot of times. And in 2011, he won the UC Davis Prize for undergraduate teaching and scholarly achievement. David Biale, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It is so great to have you.
Great to be here.
So I wanted to start in a way that I wasn't thinking to start here until I watched a video of a talk that you gave recently at UCLA where you were kind of talking about your intellectual biography. And there was a moment where you were describing how things were on campus when you were in college. And like it was those times that I think we think about, the time of the Jewish catalog and the early Chavurah movement and all of these kind of young Jews from the left, and they were dissatisfied with the society around them, and they were doing all kinds of interesting things on campus, particularly in certain kinds of Hillels and things of that nature. And the way that I understood you to be setting that up was that that time set you up for your intellectual journey that followed in your scholarship. And we've been exploring the possibility that there are ways in which that time is similar to this time, that there's, again, a kind of dis-ease with the way that the institutional Jewish world is doing Judaism, and that young people are kind of looking for something else, maybe don't quite have it in the way that they already did in the 70s because of some of the work that had been done in the 60s. And so I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about what it was like in those days for you as a young person and how that opened up a set of questions that you then started to explore as an academic, as a scholar.
Yeah, so my background actually is untraditional. I was kicked out of Sunday school, out of the Hebrew High in Los Angeles. I did not respond to the sort of standard establishment way of defining Judaism. I think that my Jewish identity was formed in part at summer camp, and I'm not unique in this. Actually, there's a recent book by Sandra Fox on Jewish summer camp.
She was a guest. We'll put that episode in the show notes.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, that's a book that we publish actually in the series that I edit at Stanford University Press. But I also feel attached to it in terms of my own biography. That kind of alternative form of Judaism was something that I imbibed as a teenager, but didn't really plan to pursue it in any professional way at all. When I got to Berkeley as a undergraduate, I found myself after a while in the orbit of this group called the Radical Jewish Union, which was an alternative Jewish group. Hillel was moribund in those days. There was a sense in which if you wanted to be Jewish, you had to do it on your own. And I felt a great kinship with people in that group. Some of those people actually had a religious background, so I actually learned a great deal about Judaism as a religion from my comrades in the movement. But we were also very political in those days against the Vietnam War, for Soviet Jewry. Our position on Israel was, in a sense, way ahead of its time. We were opposed to the occupation. It was like a youth movement experience, but at the college level. And those people actually still remain some of my closest friends. We've kept up these ties for over 50 years, which is quite remarkable. So I actually came to it sort of through the back door, you could say. I saw myself, once I decided to kind of marry my academic interests in intellectual history with my Jewish activity and began to pursue a degree in Jewish history, I saw myself as sort of the apikoros, the heretical wing of Jewish studies. And that has not changed over the years.
The fun wing.
The fun wing, right. Most of the people in the field in those days were joining the field had a religious background. I did not. I came to it from a different angle, and that has remained really the case up to this day.
Well, one of the things that seems to be gaining some interest among young people today in this kind of similar world feels to me like this idea of neo-Hasidism, this idea of some kind of spirituality that's not, let's say, the traditional kind of spirituality, such as it is, that gets taught in synagogues, conservative, reform, Orthodox synagogues these days, but something that people are sensing in the Hasidic tradition that is not necessarily that they're interested in becoming Hasidic. In fact, they're not, but that they're sensing some kind of spirituality there that maybe used to once be part of Judaism and no longer is, and they're trying to sort of look at it again. And that just struck me to wonder whether your early interest in Gershom Scholem and his work and mysticism, that was also kind of related to something similar going on at that time.
So, yes, I think so. There have been sort of, one might say, in the 20th and 21st centuries, kind of waves of Jewish Renaissance, I would define it. So, back in the 1920s in Weimar, Germany, people like Martin Buber were exploring avenues back to the tradition that were not traditional. And Hasidism played a major role in that. Hasidism was seen, of course, by the bourgeois German Jews as irrational, superstitious, and Buber tried to uncover or recover, one might say, aspects of that tradition that could still speak to modern people. In fact, one of his most important books is called Hasidism and Modern Man. So that Jewish Renaissance, I think, played a very major role in the Jewish Renaissance of the 1970s that I was part of as a university student. And it's not surprising that today there is similar kinds of interests. My own interest, I think, was less spiritual and more intellectual. And the reason I gravitated more towards Gershom Scholem than towards Martin Buber was the way in which an historian could establish a relationship with the religious past while remaining secular. Basically, he was a secular Jew, a cultural Jew, if you want. What intrigued me was how this secular historian could uncover these mystical movements while not becoming a mystic himself. Actually, I recently found the senior honors thesis that I wrote at UC Berkeley, which was on a Hebrew writer who is pretty much forgotten today named Micha Yosef Berdichevsky. I wrote about his radical philosophy of Jewish history. It's uncovering the sort of hidden movements in Jewish history, the vital forces, which are not ethics, which are not halachic, but are rather in the form of a mysticism, of revolts against the monotheistic tradition. And that was my sort of introduction to this kind of Jewish history. And then I decided to write my dissertation on Sholem, who to me was epitomized this approach.
So I feel called to give a little backstory about where this episode came from. I think both Dan and I were a small amount of familiar with your work. I've read works that cite you. I've heard from folks influenced by you. I hadn't until very recently actually read a whole lot of your work, and I regret that very much. Because what happened was every once in a while when we're planning podcast episodes, I make a trip to the various university press websites that publish Jewish studies books. And I skim around and I try to find what are some exciting books that are coming out or that recently came out. And I was on a website and I found this book whose title was Jewish Culture Between Canon and Heresy. And my first reaction to that title was, not only is this a great podcast episode, it's probably 6. We could have the Jewish culture focused episode, we could have the canon focused episode, we could have the heresy focused episode. And then I actually cracked open the book and I realized, all 3 of these terms are under sort of an umbrella of a magical 4th term that I want to start diving into, which is counterhistory. Counterhistory is a term that you bring that I think kind of unites these threads of culture and canon and heresy that are floating around in the title. And I want to hear from you, what is counterhistory? And I want to bring, from our perspective, a real glee and excitement, because we're an organization who, you look at our names, Unbound, like Judaism Unbound, the Un-Yeshiva. We are interested in countering things, not just in learning, but unlearning. When I see sort of an intellectual academic framework of a kind of Jewish counter-history, a certain way of, doing Jewish history that actively sees itself as counter, that excites me. What the heck is counter-history, and how does it serve as sort of a uniting principle among many of the essays that you put into this book?
So counter-history really is an approach I applied to Sholem. That is, and let's take him as an example of this. That is, if the canonical history of Judaism in his day was a kind of rational, bourgeois, ethical Judaism, what he argued is that there's an underside to this. There is a irrational, mystical approach that actually perhaps is not even monotheistic. That is, Judaism is composed not just of the sort of canonical ideas, which we perhaps all absorbed in Sunday school, but also of traditions that work against those canonical ideas that are always present, and that in a way the vital forces within Judaism have to take into account these counter traditions, these heretical traditions. They're not all heretical. Is Kabbalah heretical? Well, some people thought that it was. Certainly there's a kind of a polytheistic trend in Jewish mysticism which runs against the mainstream tradition. But what I would argue is that Jewish culture, and I'm glad that you pointed that out as an important term here, the book is not called Jewish religion between canon and heresy, but rather Jewish culture, because Jewish culture is a much broader umbrella that encompasses not only the canonical tradition, but also the various revolts against it, the counter traditions, the ways in which Jews have pushed back against the kind of rabbinic hegemony. I published a book that I edited, a very large book called Cultures of the Jews. And the argument really is that there isn't one Jewish culture, there are Jewish cultures in the plural, and that each of these cultures consists of obviously the canonical religious tradition, but all kinds of phenomena that push against it. So that's where the counter history comes from.
I want to go a little more into the ways you explore that culture and religion dynamic, because I think you're right to say that's a duality that operates a lot. I have this fun little, trick of mine where I'm a rabbi. And so people who are meeting me for the first time, they associate me with the religion side of that duality, which,
Right.
by the way, spoiler alert, I don't think this is a real duality. That's where I'm going with this. But I really enjoy the conversations that arise when I say to people while wearing a yarmulke, while being in a place as a rabbi, that I think of myself as a cultural Jew. They're usually confused, but it's not like a bad kind of confusion. It's like a productive kind of confusion. And it leads to great conversations about what culture means. I think the ways that cultural Jew, quote unquote, have been used sometimes is to imply like, I'm a Jew, but I don't do the religion. I might be interested in like Yiddishism. I might be interested in Jewish pop culture, which is not quite the same as Jewish culture, but is certainly part of it. I don't go to synagogue. I think like that's kind of how I think people sometimes use that phrase, cultural Jew. And I don't think it really serves us. I think that there's a lot more of an overlap between what it is to do Judaism or Jewish religion and what it is to do Jewish culture. I enjoyed, another reason that I set up this episode was like, I saw culture in the title and then I looked at the table of contents and it was like, this is a book that says Jewish culture, but then there's essays about Korach, a character from the book of Numbers in the Bible, essays about Shabtai Tzvi. These are people that are talked about in religious histories more frequently than what we term cultural histories. So can you gave us a taste already, but can you give us a little more on how we think about religion on the one hand, how we think about culture on the other, and how it might intersect with some of these counter history ideas?
You yourself said it, and that is that religion is not necessarily separate from culture. It is a part of culture. It's an essential part of Jewish culture, without a doubt. The textual tradition, starting with the Bible, the Talmud, etc., all of this is, on the one hand, part of the Jewish religion, but it is also part of a much broader kind of field, which I call culture. There's a kind of a saying, culture is the way we do things around here. So if I light Hanukkah candles, am I practicing the religion or am I partaking in culture? Or perhaps those categories are not that helpful, that they overlap, they take, a sort of sustenance from each other. There's no doubt that in describing Jewish cultures throughout the ages, what we would call religion plays a central role there, but it is not the only role. There are all kinds of other things going on. For example, in the Talmudic period, the fact that Babylonian Jews wrote these amulet bowls. Is this part of the religion or not? Well, I mean, there is magic in the Talmud. There's also magic outside of the Talmud. So it's part of this larger cultural field that includes religion. In fact, the very term religion is really a modern term. What is the equivalent in earlier Jewish history? Is it Yahadut, Judaism? That term itself is a fairly rare. It appears in the book of Maccabees in a Greek form. It's not a rabbinic term. Terms that we use today to signify Jewish religion, in fact, are pretty absent throughout Jewish history. And people thought about what they were doing, what they were practicing, which we would call religion, as part of their much broader culture.
I don't know if this is going to be a helpful comment or not, but I'm looking for some scholarly language to describe the thing that I'm trying to express, which is that for most of Jewish history and probably human history, if a person had a really important idea that they thought that they had, and they came to a room of people and said, hey, I have a really good idea, maybe they would listen to him, maybe they wouldn't. But if he came and said, God told me this really important idea, then they would all listen. Whereas now, if you come into a room and say, God told me a really cool idea, everybody immediately sends you away and never wants to talk to you again. And so I wonder whether some of the really good stuff, and I'm looking for better language than stuff, that I think of as Jewish wisdom, I mean, I'm not sure if it counts as culture or something else that is, because I think a lot of times we think of culture as sort of the trappings of our lives. I mean, foodways, clothing, arts, all of which are critically important. But I'm also talking about stuff that we tend to think of as belonging in the category of Jewish religion, but that actually is only using religion as a kind of user interface. And by saying we're secular, we're not religious, we end up throwing all of that away. And that feels tragic to me because there's a lot of really good stuff in there that people are getting confused about. And so I'm wondering, first of all, I think it's probably dangerous to float my little idea with one of the great scholars of Jewish studies, because you could just say that's completely wrong and then I'll be sad and it'll all be over. But if it sort of sounds plausible, like I'm curious if you could layer on some real scholarship onto this.
It's absolutely plausible. And I know you're searching for the right language to describe it. I wrote a book called Not in the Heavens, the tradition of Jewish secular thought. And what I argue there is that in the pre-modern period, we already have traditions which, read through our modern eyes, actually look like they're precursors to secularism. So, for example, there's the famous story in the Talmud in which it's all the rabbis against Rabbi Eliezer on a particular legal question. And Rabbi Eliezer invokes all kinds of divine miracles and then finally a divine voice on his side. And the other rabbis completely dismiss that. And they say it, meaning the Torah, is no longer in the heavens. It's here on earth. We decide what it means. Now, the story is more complicated. I could go into it, but that saying, it's not in the heavens, lo b'shamayim hi, is a very, very pregnant saying. And in fact, if you go through what you call the Jewish wisdom throughout the ages, God plays a fairly minor role, if a role at all, in the evolution of those traditions. Because, in fact, what Judaism really is a commentary on an initial revelation, but in the various generations that have come since then, people don't have revelations. In other words, what you're doing is commenting, trying to understand that original revelation in your own terms. And in that sense, what we're doing in the modern period fits right into a much longer Jewish tradition of commentary. So if our shorthand for religion is God, then in Judaism, God plays a fairly minor role. If we take the whole Jewish library, all those shelves of books, there's very little in the way of revelation. One of the really interesting things about the Sabbatean movement is that women became prophets. They would prophesy, they would claim to have some kind of divine revelation about Shabtai Tzvi, but that was a heretical thing to do. And so the role of God in the tradition is a very interesting, almost marginal one.
Yeah. I want to live in heresy realm for a while. It's a favorite realm of this podcast. We've had some wonderful episodes in the past with Jay Michelson, who wrote a book about Jacob Frank and who, yes, like us, sometimes advocates for heresy. We don't advocate for heresy just like to be radical, like for its own sake. There's a part of me that might have a little of that. But heresy, it intersects with this notion of counter-history. It's about seeing as sacred that which others mark as dafka, or like specifically not sacred. Veering into realms that are somehow marked as a no-go or taboo. That's how I sort of understand heresy. And another thing that I find so fascinating about your book, I mean, heresy's in the title. I'm kind of interested in this notion of between canon and heresy. Like, what is that spectrum? I've never thought about it as like a spectrum from canon on the one side to heresy on the other, but I'm curious what that phrasing means. But like, I've kind of espoused a notion to many people in our universe that we should see ourselves as part of a lineage of Jewish heresy, alongside, by the way, a lineage of Jewish, I don't know, orthodoxy, or like whatever we'd call the things that are not marginalized in mainstream Jewish tradition. And I even have I have a lineage that's comparable to how the book Pirkei Avot starts, where there it's like Moses gives the Torah to Joshua, who gives the Torah to ba-da-ba-da-ba, and it eventually ends up in the rabbi's hands. I have one that starts with Korach, and then it goes to this guy, Elisha ben Abuya in the Talmud, who is a noted heretic, and then eventually it gets to Emma Goldman in my framework, and then she says, no, I don't really want this. She passes it backward to Baruch Spinoza, who then it goes forward. Like, it's very wacky. But I'm kind of curious to talk more about heresy, because you have some essays in your book that show historical examples, similar to how you just said there's historical precedents maybe for secularism, you show historical examples of how people have seen a figure like Korach in the Book of Numbers, this famous rebel who is theoretically sort of against the authorities of his time, and figures like Shabbatai Tzvi. You alluded to him with the Sabbatean movement. I'm not the first one to sort of read these folks as potentially positive to some degree. And so I'm curious, for our listeners' sake, to be able to just like hear a little bit of a window into those essays, but also more broadly, how might we better think about Jewish heresy, not as like thing to be avoided, but actually rich tradition that we can inhabit?
There are different forms of heresy. So obviously Korach was this figure who rebels against Moses, and he says, all the people are prophets. He represents in the biblical tradition definitely a negative figure. To me, what was so interesting is when I began to read the Midrashim, the rabbinic commentaries on Korach, is that they were attempting to, as it were, rabbinize him, to turn him into a kind of a rebellious rabbi, like the kid in the yeshiva who's asking all kinds of what are called in Yiddish klotzkashes, that is, difficult questions that the head of the yeshiva doesn't really want to answer because clearly they lead to heresy. And Korach is just such a figure in rabbinic tradition. That to me is fascinating, to see how somebody who is labeled a villain gets reincorporated back into the tradition through these stories in the Midrash. Then there are other examples. The very first academic article that I published was on Abraham Ibn Ezra. Now, Ibn Ezra, who lived in the 12th century, is one of the canonical interpreters of the Bible, the Mikraot Gedolot, the traditional versions of the Torah consist of three major commentators, Rashi, of course, Ibn Ezra, and Ramban, or Nachmanides. And yet, once we start studying Ibn Ezra, we realize that there are incredibly heretical ideas there. Moses didn't write the whole Torah. There are things that were inserted at a later point. The Torah does not contain all wisdom, which of course was a canonical idea in his day. And he said, no, it doesn't contain all wisdom. It only contains wisdom that pertains to what he calls the sublunar world, our world. If you're interested in the supralunar world, that is the world of the constellations, of the stars, for that you need to go to the astronomers. The Torah will not help you. Right in the core of the canonical tradition, we have a writer who is toying with all kinds of what we would, I think, have to call heretical ideas. Not only that, but Ibn Ezra also hints at various people in his intellectual orbit who are saying things even more radical than he is. Back in the 12th century, we have an intellectual world which to some degree resembles our own, which is toying with various ideas that may not be acceptable sort of in the synagogue. They're not mainstream traditions. They are criticisms of it. They are new takes on it.
Is it your sense that when those things were going on, like when Ibn Ezra was writing, or when the various books of the Kabbalah, when those were written, the different people think those are different times. And you said, like, now the Kabbalah is not considered heretical by most Jews. But I guess my question is, when the people are writing these, is it your sense that they perceive of what they are writing as heretical, or that they actually perceive of what they're writing as reasonable in the time that they're writing it? And then maybe at a somewhat later time, it becomes heretical because there's kind of a lockdown, a kind of more conservative lockdown of society? I mean, I wonder about this sometimes within the Talmud itself. It feels like there's layers of times that were more open and times that were more closed. And an idea, in a certain environment, an idea can be, a little edgy, but okay to be speculating in that way. Then a few decades later, it kind of locks down in a more conservative environment. And then a couple of centuries later, they look back and they sort of imagine that thing was written during the conservative environment. They say, wow, what a hero that this person was so heretical. But actually, maybe that isn't how it was. Or is it that you really sort of perceive that at certain times in history, there are these people that are just courageous, right? That just have that they're not able to, maybe kind of like us, not that we're courageous, but that we're unable to stop ourselves from thinking these things that are counter historical or counter to the narrative that's out there. And what can you do? So you make a podcast. So I'm wondering what your sense of is to, previous podcasters in history like Ibn Ezra.
So I think it's a really good question. It's very hard to get into the heads of these people at the time, but let me maybe speak about the terms canon and heresy. These are terms that actually come out of Christianity. And even though, of course, Jews have a sense of what is canonical and what is not, and they don't have a problem labeling certain things heretical, in a sense, these categories do not apply that well to Judaism. And in fact, in every generation, there is, I would say, greater intellectual freedom than we might assume. And that's why the Talmud contains such a plethora of radical ideas, of counter traditions, of minority voices who articulate views that we find hard to understand, that they could articulate in a book that we consider canonical. I would say that Jewish tradition in general, and I mean, this is not original with me, is to say, two Jews, three opinions, or minority opinions are always preserved. This does reveal a great truth, which is that it is possible to speculate in various directions within the Jewish tradition that maybe other generations would call heretical. Now, it varies, of course, because Abraham Ibn Ezra was never considered heretical. And yet, once you delve into his views, you are engaging with something that we at least assume goes against the canonical tradition. On the other hand, someone like Baruch Spinoza was declared a heretic in his own day and was banished from the Jewish community. But Spinoza is recovered by Jews in the 19th and 20th centuries as a genuine, authentic Jewish voice. There's a wonderful book by Daniel Schwartz about Spinoza called The First Modern Jew, in which he traces the reception of Spinoza after Spinoza's life. And what it shows is that here is a thinker who Jews begin to identify with. So it's not in his own time, but it's not that much later either.
So we've had a long relationship with the idea of canon on this show, and I'm a big wordplay guy. And so a few years ago, I made the joke, but it's not a joke. I think I mean it seriously, that canon, C-A-N-O-N, and canon, C-A-N-N-O-N, which is to say, like, a thing that launches cannonballs, they're synonyms. Like, there's a reason I'm doing like a drosh, I'm doing like a wordplay thing, but I'm applying it to English. Because when you make canons, C-A-N-O-N, when you draw boundaries, when you make certain kinds of texts in and certain kinds of texts out, it's kind of a rhetorical version of shots fired. You are making a really impactful kind of statement that changes a society or a world. But I also, I'm torn on this, and I'm kind of looking for your advice, because as we've been thinking about canon over the years, I've gone through various waves. And at first, I think Dan and we talked about having a new kind of Jewish canon, expanding what our canon is, having new kinds of texts, including texts we might think of as secular or culture or whatever, that recent texts, like thinking of those as canonical. And by doing so, expand the notion of what sort of counts as authentic Jewish tradition, all these words in quotes, counts, quote unquote, authentic, quote unquote. But now, and I'm influenced by some conversations we've had recently with folks from an organization called Expanding the Canon, and also we have this initiative called Apocryphest, where we think about books of the Apocrypha and how that relates to canon and all of this. And more I'm leaning towards, like, let's upend canon. Let's not have any notion that there is canon at all, because when you make a new canon, it's just going to become limited in the next couple generations or whatever. And so I'm kind of looking, I know you're not here to be like a diagnoser of how to best make a Jewish future. Like, that's not exactly what a Jewish historian does. But I am kind of curious for your thoughts on how do we consider the tension or the collision of expanding canons, making more Jewish things seen as authentic and as historical and as rich and as part of our tradition collectively, versus upending the idea that there is an authentic Judaism, quote unquote, at all?
So I think I would associate myself more with the second thing you said. In other words, there isn't one authentic Judaism and everything else is inauthentic. But what I would argue is that in the process of exploding the canon, and here I'm going back to your metaphor of canon, C-A-N-N-O-N, exploding the canon, there has to be, I think, a deep understanding and learning of what the canon used to be. I'm really saying that a Jewish secular tradition is not just a tradition that has no roots in the earlier religious tradition or canonical tradition, but in fact, it's always in dialogue with it. You build your exploded canon on a dialogue with the Jewish library that it's existed over 3 millennia. It's sort of the way in which the term apikoros or heretic is used in the tradition. And apikoros is someone who knows the tradition very well, but nevertheless rejects it. So what my argument would be is that an authentic Jewish rebellion against the tradition is one that is always in conversation with the tradition, that is knowledgeable about it. To be a secular Jew means to engage that tradition. I mean, these books behind me, I don't believe in everything those books say. In fact, I believe
to be clear to our listeners, they can't see, but you've got Talmud books behind you. You've got all sorts of canonical, quote unquote, and other books behind you.
Right. I've got the Mishnah. I've got various translations of the Bible. I'm a secular Jew, and I put the emphasis on Jew here because of my conversation with those books that sit behind me.
I also identify as a secular Jew, more or less, and not a rabbi. You know, if Lex is going to keep saying he's a rabbi, I'm going to keep saying I'm not a rabbi. And I take that Lex, like our friend B'nai Lepi says, but I'm not that kind of rabbi. So, you know, I agree with that as well. But I'm wondering from a historical standpoint about efforts, let's say, to build a more robust secular Judaism. And I'm thinking about two things and almost the absence of a third. So I'm thinking about Europe in the time before the Second World War, in the you know that we talk of maybe in Weimar Germany, maybe more widespread than that. That there feels to me like there was a lot of progress of building a secular Jewish culture that was, like you say, deeply in contact with the canon, the previous canon. And there was something that could have happened there. And of course, because of the Holocaust, it didn't happen. And I don't know if I'm maybe just idealizing that period, but that I feel like, oh, I wish that we had something like I imagine that to be. Then there's Israel. I think that, you know, some of the early folks that you were talking about, Berdichevsky, Biale, there were people trying to explore ways of creating a rich secular Jewish culture, but I feel like it didn't really go for some reason. That I've described it as they really successfully secularized the Hebrew language, which people used to say, hey, nobody would speak Hebrew other than studying or in a synagogue. And that's completely, nobody thinks that today, right? They've completely successfully made Hebrew a secular language. But it feels to me like they didn't really do it with the religion. They didn't successfully secularize the religion. In other words, they essentially, like I said earlier, took the religion and mostly threw it away, and therefore threw away the culture that was being transmitted through a religious interface. And I'm curious if you agree with that. I'm curious whether you see the history of Israel over the last century as perhaps a place where, putting all the politics aside, a place where this kind of rich secular culture that we could dream of actually has existed more than I'm giving it credit for. And then the third place is America and the rest of the world, where it feels to me like because of various ways that America is, where in the early days religion was very central to what it meant to be an American, so the Jews thought they had to be more Jews by religion, that the whole idea of being a secular Jew never really caught on at all. And so therefore that rich secular culture hasn't emerged in America. So I'm wondering whether that analysis is more or less right, and if you could add to it in various ways, and also whether you think like maybe again, this isn't something that you think about, but how might we who are trying to bring about the kind of secular culture that I think you're dreaming of and talking about, that's deeply connected to the canon, how might we do that, learning from history in ways that perhaps were successful in the past, or learning from what hasn't been successful?
I mean, I think you're right that the sort of high water mark of secular Judaism was probably 100 years ago, both in terms of movements in Europe, like the Bund, like the Tarbut movement, but an attempt really to fashion a secular Jewish culture was rooted in mass movements. In Israel, whatever one thinks of what has happened with Zionism, its great achievement was to create, not just to revive the Hebrew language and make it a secular vernacular, but also to create a Hebrew culture. Unfortunately, in the case of Israel, what that ran against was the power of the religious establishment. The fact that the Orthodox establishment controls key aspects of daily life has made it very difficult to develop a true Hebrew culture because you end up ceding it to the religious rather than claiming it for your own. In America, I think you're also right that the swerve towards religion, towards defining Judaism as one of the three great American religions, Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism. Of course, the first two are both Christianity. That move, which is a move really of the 1950s, has broken down. And I think we are seeing various types of experimentation, of which Judaism Unbound is one, trying to formulate a new kind of approach to Jewish identity. Where this will go, I don't know. The degree to which it is grounded in the Jewish library is essential to its success. Because if it's simply floating off kind of in outer space without those ties to the historical tradition, then I think it will not be authentic and will not be successful. Perhaps I reflect my own position as a professor of Jewish studies. Jewish studies, I think, can play a very central role here in educating young Jews about that tradition, even if they completely reject it.
I want to revisit what you brought up early on related to your being shaped through that radical Jewish union group and also the time period that you were shaped, the 60s and 70s. I did clock that the word counterhistory, given your interest in the word culture, is probably related to the notion of the 60s, 70s counterculture.
Yes.
And we talked a little bit about this recently with Hasia Diner, another leading figure in Jewish studies. And she was saying similarly that her shaping in the 60s and 70s through organizing, through campus life for her at UW-Madison. I mean, it's interesting. California, Berkeley, and Wisconsin-Madison, I think if you were going to make a list of like really active campuses during that period, they'd be towards the top of that list for sure.
Yes.
But I'd love to hear your approach to that. I'm sure there are elements that overlap with hers, but like, can you give us a little more of a sense? Because, I wasn't around then. Dan wasn't around then. In what ways did that zeitgeist of, we talk about it as the 60s, but both the sense I get from you and from many others is that a lot of it came forward in the 70s. Like, how did that zeitgeist, generally or Jewishly, really serve your age of scholars and like your age of others doing different kinds of interesting upending work in Jewish life or counter work in Jewish life? Like, can you give us a window into the counterculture to counter history connection?
Right. So, I mean, this is a period in which there's a general rejection of American culture, which is linked, of course, also to politics, to the Vietnam War, to the Civil Rights Movement. The sense that America needed to be upended in order to create some kind of a new and more just society. And this was linked also to culture. Music, for example, expressing a different sort of zeitgeist. Jews took part in this counterculture, in many cases without necessarily a Jewish dimension to it. But there was also a sense among young Jews that we wanted to participate in this counterculture as Jews. that we wanted to realize our identity as Jews through opposition to establishment American culture. And that's where it came out of. So the Havurah movement was a very important element in this. Various kinds of experimentation on campuses like Berkeley and Wisconsin, I think, very important. Many of us went to Israel during those years as volunteers on kibbutzim. This is the pre-birthright attachment to Israel. In other words, it's not a free trip that is curated by adults, but rather you went on your own dime, and you explored the country, and you explored what it meant to live in a living Jewish culture, which is what Israel was in those days. And so all of these different influences, I think, came together in the Jewish student movement of the late 60s and early 70s. It was a very exciting moment, I have to say, looking back on it. We were inventing it ourselves. It wasn't handed to us by adults, but instead was fashioned by young people. The major question today is, are young people, once again, in an entrepreneurial fashion, creating something new, something that is not being handed to them by an older generation?
So I'm really getting a sense from our conversation with you, you're bringing to life something that you actually spoke about in the introduction to your book, which is, we talked to a lot of scholars and we've had many amazing conversations. Some of them are really resistant and hesitant to do the work of, okay, so I studied a historical era. Here's ways in which it applies to our time in 2023, 2024, and beyond. They don't want to do that. And there's this, one of the swear words of academia. I mean, there's different swear words in different contexts, different curses. And one of them is presentism. You're doing presentism. Mm-hmm. And you're applying your contemporary 21st century lens onto the past in ways that make you misunderstand the past. We and you and others, we don't want to be doing that. But as a podcast, we are very interested in that mapping work of historical learning onto our now. And you also seem interested in that. And so I guess I'm curious as we close to think about like that endeavor, because it's a complicated one. On the one hand, there's scholars who are nervous about it from a sense of like it could lead to poor scholarship that deprioritizes categories of the past in favor of our own categories now. And I think that's valid. And the other side is there's people who really, if you tell them that they should look to Ibn Ezra or Korach or whatever else from the past, and that should be, they should devote time in their life to that, and that could apply to their world, a lot of people I think are going to respond like, there's enough to focus on right now. Like, why would I go to history books? Mm-hmm. So like, can you make that sort of dual case for the very act of doing historical research, learning deeply about our past, and consciously applying it to our now and not thoroughly segmenting that work into past on the one hand and present and future on the other?
Right. So in the introduction to this book, I make a distinction between presentism and constructivism. I define my method as constructivist. What do I mean by that? I mean that our present moment throws up certain questions for us. So one example is sexuality is, since Michel Foucault has become a kind of a central theme in our understanding of the world. Now, what we do is we take questions from the present and we apply them to the past. In other words, we ask of our sources, what do our sources think about sexuality? And I don't want to force the sources to say something that is necessarily the same as what I would say, but I want to see what those sources say about a contemporary question. And it may be something quite different, quite alien from my present understanding. And that's the way we construct a secular Jewish tradition, is by constructing the past according to contemporary questions, but allowing that past to be authentic to itself. We do not want to distort the sources. We want them to speak in their own voice. And what I've argued during this podcast is that you can't have an authentic cultural Judaism or secular Judaism today that is divorced from that past. The past has to be part of it. And that's where it gains its depth and its meaning. from that tradition, even as it refuses to accept the canonical lessons of that tradition.
Thank you so much, David Biale, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. And of course, as we close, we want to remind you that you can always be in touch with us with your ideas, visions, questions. Any of that is super welcome. Here are a wide variety of ways for you to do so. First, there's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Second, there's JudaismUnbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode and all sorts of other resources. Third, you can email Dan and I at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. And we are deeply, deeply grateful if you are able to support us financially via a one-time gift or a recurring donation, which you can do via JudaismUnbound.com/donate. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.